Good day everyone, Max here from Evidence-Based Football Manager. This is part 2 of my youth intake research video. I wasn't planning on doing a part 2 video on the subject of youth intake, but after I uploaded my last video, I realized that there were way too many stones left unturned regarding youth intake. So you know what, I'm turning this into a full-blown video series. 1 or 2 videos is just not gonna cut it. I don't know how many videos this is gonna take, but it doesn't matter. I know I've opened a can of worms and I intend to get to the bottom of it. So I've renamed the last video to part 1 and this video is going to be part 2 of my brand new youth intake video series for FM23. In my last video, I told you that youth intake in Football Manager is based around 2 events in the game that recur on an annual basis. The first one is the youth preview event, which takes place sometime in December. And the second one is the youth announcement event, which takes place sometime between March and April for most clubs in Europe. This means that there are 3 time points during a season in Football Manager where a variable can make a difference on the quality of the youth intake of that season. The first time point is just before the youth preview event in December. The second time point is just after the youth preview event. And the third time point is just before the youth announcement event in March or April. This third time point was the focus of my last video, where I tried changing lots of different variables one day before the youth announcement event for AZ Alkmaar. A lot of you told me that changing something just before the youth announcement wouldn't make any difference to the quality of the youth intake, but I actually thought that a lot of the variables were surprisingly effective. Variables like junior coaching and the youth rating of Holland could either increase or decrease the CA or PA ratings of players by up to 15 points either way compared to the control, which is pretty impressive given that those variables only had one day to exert their effects. I'll be focusing on the third time point again in this video before I move on to the first 2 time points in the next videos. I know the third time point was already discussed in my last video, but there were some variables that I should have tested that I didn't. So I just wanted to really make sure that the third time point is covered comprehensively today so that we can really close that book, rule out what can be ruled out before I move on to the other time points. Now, some of you also told me that there are some variables that can only be changed using the pre-game editor that might also have an impact on the quality of the youth intake, such as the population of the city where the club is based, and also the youth importance rating of the club that you're managing. Those variables will be tested as well, not today, but later in this video series. In the last video, the following variables were tested at the third time point of AZ Alkmaar: youth facilities, youth recruitment, junior coaching, youth rating of Holland, and also some of the attributes of the head of youth development. Today I'll be presenting more variables that I tested, including the reputation of the club, the reputation of the league, the quality of your youth team coaches, and also more attributes of the head of youth development that I didn't test last time. The experiment setup for today is the same as last time, but I'll go through it again anyway. I was in charge of AZ Alkmaar, which is a club in the Dutch Eredivisie. I progressed the game until the 24th of December, which is just before the youth preview event for AZ Alkmaar. The variables being tested were either set as 10 out of 20 or they were left at their default values. Then the game was progressed to early April, which is just before the youth announcement event. A save point was created at this point, and from that save point, I ran repeated trials where the game was simulated to the next day, so that's one day after the youth announcement event. Then I recorded the attributes of the youth candidates who had freshly just arrived at the club. The first set of trials is when all the variables were set at their middle values, like 10 out of 20. So that kind of acts as like the control group. And once the control was established, I changed the variables either to their minimum values, like 1 out of 20, or to their maximum values, like 20 out of 20. Repeat trials were conducted with those settings so that the results could be compared against the control. All right, we'll go straight to the results. Just like last time, I've made some bar graphs here that show you the relationship between the variables being tested and their effects on the players' CA ratings, PA ratings, and also on the players' hidden attributes. In all of these graphs, I'm looking for a clear 3-step positive uptrend between these bars before I can establish a relationship between a variable and the outcome. You might have noticed that the control values shown in these graphs are slightly different from the control values that I used in my last video. And that's because last time I only had 20 trials in the control group, which I thought maybe wasn't a big enough sample size. So I increased the sample size to 30 trials this time, which is why the values for the control are slightly different from last time and slightly more reliable due to the larger sample size. Now, I know these graphs look a little bit daunting. They're even bigger than the graphs that I showed you last time. And that's only because you told me to test a lot of things. So rather than going through all these numbers one by one, which will take 2 hours and it will put everyone to sleep, I'll just point out to you some key findings from these graphs. I'll be uploading all this data on my public Dropbox folder anyway. So if you wanted to take a closer look at the numbers, you can feel free to do so by going to my Dropbox. So, key findings. Basically, the variables that are related to your club facilities influence the CA ratings and the PA ratings of your players, while the hidden attributes of your head of youth development influence the corresponding hidden attribute of your players. Actually, that is the main take-home message from today's video. Club facilities is more to do with the CA and PA ratings of youth intake, whereas the head of youth development is more to do with the personality of the youth intake. If you take a look at this graph here, you can see that the CA ratings of players were affected by the level of junior coaching and also by the reputation of your club, whereas the PA ratings of players were affected by the level of junior coaching and also by the youth rating of Holland, which is the home nation of AZ Alkmaar. The reputation of the league, on the other hand, had no impact on the quality of the youth intake, which is slightly surprising because I thought maybe the reputation of the league was a relevant factor, but it's not, according to the results that we have here. So in case you're managing a top reputation club like Man City and you somehow get yourself relegated to the championship, fear not, because it's the reputation of the club that matters and not the reputation of the league. As Man City, you'll still get great wonder kids even after you get relegated. You can guide your club back to the Premier League, so don't worry, you'll be just fine. In regards to the head of youth development, the rule is simple. The hidden attributes that determine the personality of your head of youth will influence the corresponding hidden attribute of your youth intake. If your head of youth has high professionalism, the players will have high professionalism. And if your head of youth has high loyalty, the players are more likely to have a slightly higher loyalty. Such correlation was not observed, however, for the controversy attribute, which makes sense because controversy is not one of the hidden attributes that affect the personality of players. Determination, on the other hand, is one of the attributes that determine the personality of players in Football Manager, but no correlation was observed between the determination of the head of youth and the determination of your youth intake. Alright, I've done a little side experiment here that might interest you. I tried sacking the head of youth development along with a few other senior members of staff so that no one is in charge of youth intake duties for AZ Alkmaar. In FM23, if you go into the staff responsibilities page and if you go to advice and reports, here you can set the staff member who will be in charge of youth intake duties. I know here it just says provide youth development information, which is a little bit unclear, if not misleading. But if you hover your mouse here, the tooltip does tell you that this is the role that's responsible for bringing the next generation of young players into the club. So what I tried was to sack all 4 of these staff members from AZ Alkmaar just before the youth announcement event, so that no one is in charge of this duty. Then I ran some tests to see what happens. And let's take a look at these graphs here. The blue colored bars represent the control, and the orange colored bars represent the scenario when the head of youth was fired. And you can see that in both scenarios, the heights of these bars are pretty much the same. Having no head of youth development resulted in youth intakes with a quality that's more or less comparable to the control, which is when the head of youth had 10 in all attributes and hidden attributes. I did hear a rumor somewhere that having no head of youth development guarantees perfect youth intakes, but that doesn't seem to be the case, at least according to these tests, when the head of youth was fired just before the youth announcement event. It's still an interesting experiment, and I will try repeating this experiment in my next videos, where I will try firing the head of youth at different time points of the season, and I'll see if that makes any difference to the quality of the youth intakes. Another suggestion I received from the last video is to focus just on the top few players from each youth intake rather than looking at the entire cohort as a whole. Because after all, who cares if you've got 200 youngsters rated D or E, as long as you've got 1 or 2 wonder kids rated A. So my next task was to investigate whether all these variables affect an elite youngster in the same way they affect the rest of the cohort. With AZ Alkmaar, with the save file that I was using, there were 3 youth candidates who were consistently at the top of the class. I want you guys to meet these 3 blokes: René Tielemans, Kenji Roos, and Peter Jan Rekker. I'm going to call these 3 guys the 3 musketeers of the 2023 youth intake for AZ Alkmaar. So I've constructed a separate graph here, just using the data for our 3 musketeers. Remember, I'm trying to find out whether these variables affect top quality wonder kids in a way that's any different from the rest of the cohort. And in short, the answer is no. All these variables that I tested affected the 3 top youth candidates of AZ Alkmaar in the same way and in the same degree that they affected all other youth candidates. And the variables that were ineffective for the entire cohort were also ineffective for our 3 musketeers. I know I'm quickly going over lots of information here at once, and that's only because I'm trying to keep things concise. But yeah, as far as I can tell, there is no evidence to suggest that the in-game variables affect elite youngsters in the game in a way that's any different from the not-so-elite youngsters. Okay, time to make a summary of the test results that I showed you today. This summary will overlap a little bit with the summary from my last video, but this one is more comprehensive compared to the last one. 1. The following variables have a correlative relationship with the CA and PA ratings of the youth intake: junior coaching of your club, youth rating of your club's home nation, and also the reputation of your club. 2. The following personality attributes of the head of youth development have a correlative relationship with the corresponding personality attribute of the youth intake: ambition, professionalism, loyalty, pressure, sportsmanship, and temperament. Note that determination is also one of the personality attributes in Football Manager, but there is no relationship between the determination of the head of youth development and the determination of the youth intake. 3. When you sack your head of youth just before the youth announcement event, the result is very similar to having a very mediocre head of youth who is 10 in all attributes and hidden attributes. 4. There is no evidence to suggest that the in-game variables affect elite youngsters in a way that's any different from the not-so-elite youngsters. Do remember that in all of these tests, the variables were changed 1 day before the youth announcement event. The relationship between the variables and the quality of the youth intake will be different if the variables are changed at other time points during the season, which will be investigated in my next videos. Okay people, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I know a lot of the stuff from today has already been covered in the last video, but I did conduct some extra tests that I believe can augment and strengthen the test results that I showed you last time. Alright people, I do have a special announcement to make. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but this channel, Evidence-Based Football Manager, has just hit 10k subscribers recently. This is a special milestone for me because when I first started doing these Football Manager videos about 2 years ago, I told myself, all right, Max, let's try getting to 10k subscribers first because, 10k is like a nice even number. They can kind of act as like a goal that I can work towards. So yeah, hitting 10k subscribers is it's a pretty special feeling for me. I want to thank everyone for all the support and all the trust that you've shown me for the past 2 years. It's been a tough journey, but at the same time, it's been a massively rewarding journey. I first started running this channel during the COVID lockdowns because during the lockdowns, my work was cut in half and I needed a project where I could divert my time and energy. I was fairly new to the Football Manager scene at the time, and I noticed that within the Football Manager community, there was a demand for resources and guides based on data and evidence and not just on anecdotes. And that demand, in my view, was just not being met, or at least on YouTube. So I thought, well, why don't I give it a go? And that's how it all started. There were times, more than once, where I felt like quitting, but I kept going because you told me that there was value in what I was doing. This whole thing started as a hobby, but now it's turned into something that means a lot more to me. So I want to thank all of you who recognized what I was doing and told me to keep going. People, keep those comments coming. I welcome all kinds of feedbacks, positive feedbacks, negative feedbacks, nice comments, not so nice comments. It doesn't matter. Just tell me and I'll try to respond as much as I can. I have to say, it is getting a little bit hard to respond to every single comment. So if you don't get a response from me, please don't feel bad. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring you. It just means that maybe I'm struggling a little bit to keep up with all the new comments. Anyway, guys, thanks again, and yeah, that's about it for today. This youth intake series will be continued. Cheers, guys.